toilet seats. In this case, I think that we need to carefully examine every nook and cranny of the FBI's budget to make sure we're getting what was advertised, and I intend to be a part of that effort in the coming months, because what I have found is that senior management within the FBI puts too much focus on its image and budget and not enough on product, and that product should be law enforcement and public safety. In that respect, this hearing, Mr. Chairman, is much needed. But the director is pressed for time, so I've decided to limit the amount of questions, and then I'm going to insert a lot of documents in the record. Mr. Free, I recently saw Dr. Whitehurst, the crime lab whistleblower, on TV. He was asked what he thought about the way the Justice Department and the FBI had criticized him. The criticism came despite Dr. Whitehurst's success in calling attention to the lab's problems. Dr. Whitehurst responded that he thought the criticism was great because it allowed the public to see what they do in Washington to shoot the messenger. I can't tell you how many people come up to me puzzled about why the messenger is being shot since he pointed out the wrongdoing. In his letter to you dated March the 6th, Inspector General Bromwich states that the FBI had proposed for over a year that Dr. Whitehurst be fired. The IG was opposed to it. But for over a year, the FBI was trying to shoot the messenger. It also sounds like the FBI was intimidating the IG into being harsh in its criticism of the whistleblower. On April 15th, the day the IG's report on the lab came out, the FBI acknowledged serious problems in the lab. In my view, the lab reflects a failing of FBI senior management. So, question, has the FBI finally resigned itself to the fact that Fred Whitehurst is not the problem and that the crime lab and senior management are the problem?
Senator, I certainly don't think that Dr. Whitehurst is the problem. I never have, and I've never either said or promoted or supported that. We are thankful for the matters which were raised in part by Mr. Whitehurst and certainly followed through and inspected fairly and thoroughly by the Inspector General's report. He's not the issue here. The issue is, as you point out, substantial failings, mostly scientific failings, in the laboratory over many, many years. And for the period that I've been director, I certainly take direct responsibility. I'm the ultimate manager for the laboratory. We initiated, as you know, before the Inspector General, our own internal inquiry in the laboratory, which did not, unfortunately, turn up the problems which were sustained in the Inspector General report. I think part of the problem was we didn't use what the Inspector General used, which was a very renowned group of outside scientists who came in and, as only scientists can evaluate other scientists, did, I think, a top-notch job. We are, for the record, now looking at all the other 20 units in the laboratory internally. We've gone out and retained scientists, independent scientists, to look at each one of the other 20 units to see if we have additional problems, and we'll deal with those forthrightly. But I don't hold anyone, certainly not Dr. Whitehurst, responsible for our problems. With respect to your questions about discipline or matters relating to his work there, as you know, I've been recused from those and remain recused from those. However, I rely on the Inspector General's report, which dealt with any issues of intimidation with respect to Dr. Whitehurst. I certainly don't think this Inspector General was intimidated by the FBI. I think the report was fair, hard-hitting, accurate, and we're implementing all of his recommendations.
The subject of the Inspector General's March 6th letter to you was a request that you correct the record for your testimony the day before. You had just testified before the House Appropriations Subcommittee. You had stated that the sole reason for suspending Dr. Whitehurst was based on the IG's report on him. The IG called you on it because that was an inaccurate, and you admitted that it was inaccurate. And in my view, you were trying at that point to hide behind the IG's report and use it to justify what you clearly wanted to do for over a year, and that is shoot the messenger. Your inaccurate testimony and your hiding behind the IG report misled the public. Do you wish to comment on that?
Yeah, I take great exception to that. I think what happened there was very clear. I made a statement to a committee, as I've testified dozens and dozens of times over 3.5 years, that was partially correct but partially incorrect. The reason it was incorrect is I was recused from all of those matters relating to his administrative leave, and I was not aware of that. As soon as the Inspector General brought it to my attention, I corrected the record. I spoke to Chairman Rogers, who accepted my explanation without any problem. I certainly wasn't hiding behind any report. I was correcting a mistake in my testimony, which I've done many times, and I would never misrepresent to a Congress or a committee. Never have and never will.
Well, that's your view, and you're entitled to your view. I see it as an effort to get at a bearer of bad news. I think what Dr. Whitehurst was talking about for 8 years, you saw as hurting the FBI's image. I think you didn't inspect the product, as Mr. Esposito had admitted in his statement. He says the problems identified by the Inspector General should never have been permitted to develop. There was a clear and serious failing in not adequately detecting these problems, and in many instances not moving swiftly enough to resolve them. And that's after 8 years that there was a problem out there.
Well, I agree with that. I certainly don't see how you could characterize that as trying to promote another different image.
Okay, I want to place some things in the record. In 1994, when you were the new FBI director, you directed Howard Shapiro and a team of lawyers to review the Whitehurst allegations. In a report of that review dated May the 26th, 94, it is clear to me now that the FBI was aware of the lab's problems but whitewashed them. For instance, it appears that you learned of all the problems associated with Terry Rudolph. He was the lab senior examiner and explosive residues before Dr. Whitehurst was. All of Rudolph's cases are now under red alert because of sloppiness and improper procedure. Pursuant to a FOIA request, I was able to get that May 94 report, and this is the entire report, but the only section on the only section that we can't see is the section on what you uncovered related to Rudolph. I'd like to show you what this is the section. You can see that there's not anything there to get information on. In other words, the FBI doesn't want to show the public that it knew and that you knew back in '94 that there were serious problems in the lab. And that's not all. One of Dr. Whitehurst's allegations was that his lab reports were being altered. The May '94 report whitewashed that allegation. Yet through his persistence, his unit chief eventually investigated the same allegation. The unit chief then received similar allegations from a second lab scientist as well. An investigation was done at that point. The unit chief found that lab reports had been altered intentionally and that it amounted to altering evidence, and the unit chief recommended disciplining the culprit. Instead, the culprit was promoted. On June the 12th, '95, the Bureau's chief counsel noted in a memo that altered reports could subject the FBI to civil or criminal liability, so the FBI was fully aware of the serious problem. Well, I started before the red light went on, and I'm about ready to ask I got 2 pages here to ask the final question. This is one of several documents that I have dated from November 4th, '94 through September '94, showing that the FBI knew how serious the problems were of the lab involving altering of reports, which amounted to, of course, altering evidence, which may have resulted in civil or criminal liability, and I'm going to place these documents in the record. When Dr. Whitehurst's allegations finally became public, and that was right around the time that you, Director Free, issued the following statement in response to the November 5th November 8th, on November the 8th, you said this: to date, the FBI has found no evidence tampering, evidence fabrication, or failure to report exculpatory evidence, and finding of such misconduct will result in tough and swift action by the FBI. And of course, the tough and swift action was to promote the culprit, Tom Thurman, who incidentally was one of those allegedly disciplined based on the IG report. So in my view, Mr. Director, your comment on November 95 was at best incomplete. It misled the public about whether problems existed in the lab. And of course, at that point, the FBI's image was at stake. And so your testimony March 5th before the House Appropriations Subcommittee was not the first time that you misled the public about this issue. Whatever your comments on that.
Well, my comment is very clear. I take great exception to that. If that report...
I've got the documents here.
I know you have the documents.
Where your people say that. I've got your statement where you said it on November the 8th, and 4 months later I've got what you said.
We disagree on your characterization of the motive, which is very important. But
well, forget the motive. What about the facts?
Well, the fact is, I think that when we did that internal review, as I said, it was an inadequate review. We did not appreciate either the problems or the significance of what needed to be done by scientists. But if you look at the Inspector General's report, which found no obstruction of justice and no perjury, those findings were not all that different from what we found in that narrow area.
Well, my point is that when the statements of public officials don't match the facts, then that's when we have credibility problems.
Well, I agree, but I think it's important to understand what the nature and what the motive of those statements, of the person who made those statements. I certainly didn't make any statements to mislead anybody. I certainly haven't tried to protect anybody's image at the expense of honesty or truthfulness, and I take great exception to your suggestion.
Well, you said something on March the 5th different than what you had said on November. Mr. Chairman, I'm done.
Do you have anything else?
No.
Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before asking questions, Mr. Chairman, if I might, as a matter of personal privilege, Mr. Chairman, you noted earlier that Carl Malone was interested in being an FBI agent, and I would just like to make a matter of statement for the record that Special Agent Michael Jordan...
Don't have any cheap shots here, as always.
Special Agent Michael Jordan got his man last Sunday night, and I just wanted to put that on the record.
We'll see about tonight. And the remaining 6 games.
I'm in trouble now. Director Freed, thank you for...
Well, you've used your time. I'm ready.
Am I finished? Director Freed, thanks for being with us today. Senator Specter asked a line of questioning which we anticipated, and I think your response was appropriate. I hope you will concede that this apparent leak from your agency probably did a disservice to your agency, as well as your relationship with the Attorney General, and could jeopardize at least some of the important jobs being done in your agency. I know that your relationship with the Attorney General is very important. I also know that the ability of the Director of the FBI to have communications with the Attorney General and do so privately is also very important. I'd like to know what you have done about this apparent leak and what you think the impact of this leak has been on your agency and your relationship with the Attorney General.
Well, first of all, I don't know where the leak came from. I'm not prepared to say that it came from the FBI. I hope it did. I'm not ruling that out. I just don't know. We are bewildered and burdened, as you know, not just in this particular matter, but in almost every other matter that we deal with in Washington with leaks. I wish I had the answer to that. We automatically initiate inquiries when these matters happen. We rarely and very infrequently are able to identify anyone. If we were, we would take very severe and very certain action. With respect to the impact on our relationship, I don't think it's had any. The Attorney General and I have a very strong relationship. We have a very good personal relationship. She knows that if I had something to say, I'd say it publicly. It's never been my style to do it otherwise, and I think she appreciates the confidence that we enjoy on those matters, and I don't think it's affected the working relationship between the FBI and the department attorneys.
I'm glad to hear that, and I hope you are following up on that, because I believe that it's an important part of your responsibility, and it could undermine the effectiveness of the agency if it became a larger problem. Let me address a couple other issues that I think are worthy of concern. You last month directed your 56 field offices of the FBI to have at least 2 specifically trained agents devoted solely to working on crimes against children. I want to applaud you for that. One recent report indicated that over 4,000 children a year are abducted by strangers in my home state of Illinois. There have been sad and unfortunate incidents when that has occurred. I take it that part of the problem here, in terms of the FBI response to child abduction, is when it becomes a matter of interstate concern or of statutory responsibility for the FBI. Do you feel that there are changes needed in the law to give the FBI the ability to make a quicker response to these reported abductions?
Senator, I do not. We have a policy which I reminded our SACs about in the teletype several months ago, that when there is a child abduction, particularly one that is a suspicious one, even without any of the requirements for a federal kidnapping violation, our SACs and our agents respond immediately, certainly at the request of the state or local police, even without any establishment of possible jurisdiction. We do that automatically.
May I ask,
yeah,
on that point, when you say the FBI responds immediately, even without the request of the local law enforcement?
No, with a request.
With the request.
I'm sorry.
I see. And do you know what that means? What kind of time frame we're talking about? Is that a matter of 24 hours or?
No, it's immediate. In fact, when we had this very tragic disappearance of the 2 girls in Spotsylvania, within an hour, FBI agents were on the scene. They worked all weekend. They did searches as well as profiling and setting up computer software to work the case. We work immediately. We don't hesitate at all.
You think the current legal framework between the federal government, state and local governments is adequate to respond to this challenge?
Yes, I do.
All right. Let me move to another issue which is obviously very topical. The conviction of McVeigh in Denver was noted by the Washington Post this morning as an extraordinary crime in American history. It is rare, maybe not unprecedented, but certainly rare, that someone, an American, would be involved in an act of terrorism which took and claimed so many lives. As the FBI has investigated that, have you reached any conclusions as to whether or not you need additional tools or additional legal authority to deal with this brand of domestic terrorism?
Senator, if I could make my answer separate and apart from that trial. As you know, it's in a very delicate phase this morning, and none of us would want to say anything which would interfere with that. With the additional counterterrorism resources that Congress has given us in the last year, particularly the doubling of the agents and the support staff necessary to work these cases, the expansion of the LEGAT program, the efforts to solve the CALEA telecommunications access problem, I think we have substantial and good resources. What we need to do, which is what one of the senators alluded to, is now absorb and train many new people in some very technical and sophisticated areas and techniques. But my view is that the legislation, with the exception perhaps of the multi-point wiretap, the legislation that we have now, including the extraterritorial authority for counterterrorism cases, gives us ample resources.
It seems that one of the more nettlesome problems the FBI has faced, even before you're taking office, could be traced back to this whole militia movement, militia mentality, which came out during the course of this trial and has come out many times in the past. Is this a growing problem in our nation in terms of a threat to our domestic tranquility, if you will?
I don't think so, Senator. We've worked very hard to try to evaluate and analyze the activity that you refer to. Most of the militia organizations around the country are not, in our view, threatening or dangerous. The instances of violence that we've seen, Republic of Texas being one instance, the Freeman, a potential situation, are really the exception to the larger militia organizations and movements, most of which, in my view, don't propose any threat. After the bombing in Oklahoma, we had all of our SACs go out and contact, mostly to the local sheriffs, the leaders of the most prominent militia groups around the country. We've maintained a dialogue with them since that time. On some occasions, they've been helpful in even identifying people who they view as dangerous to others. So my view is that we're dealing with a small number of people, sometimes leaderless groups, sometimes individuals, and not a full-scale movement which poses grave dangers.
So going to page 3 of your testimony, where you say that terrorism, domestic and international, threatens us like never before, can you give us some parameters? Senator Kyle and I
Yes.
serve on his subcommittee on terrorism. I'm sure he'll have some interest in this too. But where do you see the threat growing when it comes to terrorism?
Well, I mean, if you look at some of the recent instances, the World Trade Tower bombing, the Oklahoma City bombing, the attacks last summer in Saudi Arabia against U.S. interests, these are very large-scale and very direct attacks against United States persons or interests overseas. That's the trend that we're concerned about. We've made cases where individuals have, in Texas recently, in the alleged attempt to disguise a robbery, were willing to blow up a huge gas tank farm as a diversion. We have cases where people are using ricin and anthrax and bubonic plague for possible acts of terrorism or criminal acts. I think the activity of the organized terrorist groups, particularly Hamas and Hezbollah, both inside and outside the United States, are a growing phenomena. The state-sponsored terrorism activities have not abated. In fact, they've increased. And that's the trend that we're concerned about both abroad and at home.
Another issue that we are considering, Senator Cole and I have introduced legislation asking for child safety locks to be sold with firearms, handguns in the United States in particular. And I've noted that it's been a directive of the FBI for several years now that your agents all have trigger locks or child safety devices for their own firearms. Some of the critics of this legislation say that, if you require people to put that kind of a safety device on a gun, it won't be accessible when they really need it. What has your experience been at the FBI with this policy that requires child safety locks or trigger locks?
I think it's worked very well. I think it hasn't, impeded any readiness or ability to protect. I think it's a very simple but very wholesome requirement. Having 5 small boys myself, I think it's a very good idea, whether or not it's mandated or not.
16 kids are killed every day with guns, and 512 children died in unintentional handgun shootings in 1994. And I think most parents would agree that this is a reasonable thing. I'm glad that it has worked. I see that my time is about up, and I don't want to presume upon it. I'll make one last question. On the question of economic espionage, is it your understanding that this espionage is going in both directions, that the United States is engaged in spying and espionage in foreign countries when it comes to trade secrets and industry?
No, I don't think it's a similar activity. What you have, I think, in stark contrast to any intelligence activities performed by our own agencies, among the 23 countries that I alluded to that engage in this type of activity, the goal and the reality in many of those acquisitions is to turn over those trade secrets to state industries to manufacture and outcompete the U.S. companies, particularly the companies whose intellectual property or trade secret has been stolen. That has never been the practice or policy with respect to any of our activities, and I think that's what makes the problem a distinct one, which is addressed by the statute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Thompson.
Thank you, Director Free. I appreciate the answer to that last question. I think the idea that we do everything nefarious or underhanded or improper or illegal that any other country does, and therefore we should not be concerned about it, is one that needs to be dispelled. at every opportunity, and I think that you have effectively done that. Let me ask you about a specific situation that occurred in Memphis, Tennessee yesterday that I know that you're aware of. Reports are that an FBI SWAT van full of weapons and thousands of rounds of ammunition, including I think a couple of grenade launchers, was stolen from a parking lot at a hotel where agents were staying. What can you tell us about that in terms of your own regulations, in terms of where the investigation stands, in terms of public safety and security in that area right now?
Yes, Senator. We certainly have put on a full court press to try to immediately retrieve and find those weapons, which are very dangerous weapons as you described them. We also have initiated an internal inquiry to look at the facts and circumstances to see exactly what happened and whether or not any of our regulations were violated. This was a visiting team, as you may know. It was a Little Rock team in Memphis for a exercise, a multi-district exercise. Apparently they went to the hotel where they had reservations. It was booked. They were sent to another hotel, and the van was left unattended where it was stolen. We think it was stolen, and the materials taken out before it was set on fire.
Was it stolen? Was it overnight?
Yes,
you know
it was during the night hours, during the early morning hours. We have some regulations that require, for instance, trunks to be locked with chain locks, that there be placement racks, locked gun racks in certain cars.
This had no trunk, I assume.
This was a Suburban. It had no trunk. It had no alarm, as far as I know. So we're going to look at that and see whether or not we have a problem with respect to not having tougher and more protective measures there.
I believe you also have rules as to how long you can leave weapons unattended in a vehicle.
Yes, that would have been within that rule, but that's really not at issue here. It was left unattended, and we've got to get all the facts and circumstances.
I'm sure that you're doing everything to work with local authorities there, and that
yes,
it's probably difficult to assess the public safety aspect of it right now. Is that?
It is, because we can't account for the weapons. The case is being worked by actually one of our FBI state and local task forces, which does stolen vehicle cases. We think that's the best bet for trying to solve it as quickly as we can.
All right, sir. Let me ask you in another area. We've talked about your expanding jurisdiction, the technological age that we live in, and the different requirements that are being placed on you. And of course, the Congress is increasingly placing requirements on you also. We're passing legislation that is broadening your jurisdiction. I think you testified, I think it was last year, that there were about 60 new jurisdictions at that time. The anti-terrorism law, for example, used to protect any federal law enforcement officer. I think that's expanded now to any federal employee. The gun-free schools law, it's against the law now, federal law. It's a federal crime for some small school in some rural area for someone to possess a gun on school property. That's now a matter that FBI has got to investigate. We're going to be considering a juvenile crime bill that's going to expand the juvenile gang aspect of this. I know that you're aware that that's our job and not yours, and as to what sound policy is in this area. But from your standpoint, have you had an opportunity as a bureau to make an assessment as to what that is doing to your resources, how much it is going to require in additional resources? Do you try to get ahead of the curve, assuming that Congress is going to continue to federalize what's been state law and under the state purview for many years? What are your views about that, and how are you handling it?
With respect to expanding federal jurisdiction, particularly FBI statutes of authority, it does become increasingly difficult to cover all of the jurisdiction. For instance, in the domestic violence statute, which is a federal statute, the child support requirements now by legislation, we have to assign people, we should assign people to work those cases. But it's a very difficult balance, particularly in a small office, if you have less than 100 agents, to do something with respect to a new jurisdiction on child support, but also deal with the bank embezzlements and the kidnappings and the things that don't change. What we're hopeful of is...
Well, you have everything now from a potential Oklahoma bombing situation to some kid with a gun in a rural school.
Exactly. And it becomes very difficult to cover everything. We have, as I mentioned in my opening statement, about 718 agents who work on our Safe Street task forces. They're doing basically what state and local authorities have the primary responsibility to do, which is violent crime and gang crimes and things like that. We feel it's important for the federal presence in those task forces to be there. In fact, we're required and asked by the state and local partners to be there. We're not there except by invitation. If we have a crime rate violent crime rate, which keeps decreasing by 7%, homicides by 11%, I would like to take some of those resources and put them into the areas which are of particular expertise for us, our white-collar areas, our counterterrorism areas, our organized crime areas. But every time there's a new statute, we're spread a little bit thinner without new resources.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think several of us do, and I think we need to consider that as we consider all this legislation that makes us feel good because we're able to issue a press release saying that we've done something about some area that's been the purview of states for 200 years without considering the fact that we're necessarily taking away to a certain extent from some of the things that have been traditionally FBI areas, very important areas, all of them. I'm going to relinquish the rest of my time and just finish by saying that I've been critical in several areas that the FBI has been involved in, Ruby Ridge and so forth, but I must say there comes a time when we need to recognize the good work that you're doing and the challenges that you have. It's time to stop tearing down and start building up again. And I think that with all the problems that the Bureau has had, and all of our institutions in this country have had in the last several years, I might add, that we make sure that we recognize that the most important part of dealing with that is having somebody at the top with independence and integrity. And you have that, and you've demonstrated that. And with that, we'll work our way through these problems that have been described, which do concern all of us. So with that, I will relinquish the balance of my time.
Director Free, I would ask on just sort of follow up with what Senator Thompson said about the van that was stolen. Is there a specific procedure if you have a vehicle that is filled with ammunition, weapons, bulletproof vests, things of this nature? Is there a specific procedure as to where such a vehicle would be left overnight or left without somebody in it? I realize it has to be left at some time, but
Yes.
is there a procedure?
There's no specifically required procedure. At least that's what I learned yesterday. What we normally try to do is put it in a police pound or a fire department yard or some type of area that is secure as opposed to an unattended parking garage at a hotel, and that's what our internal inquiry is going to look at. We may need more specific requirements in that area.
Director, the Speaker of the House, Mr. Gingrich, has been an unspoken critic of your leadership at the FBI. I obviously take a different view, but I now read in the paper that he may urge appropriators to cut FBI's funding because the FBI is investigating possible improper fundraising activity by a Republican member of the House. And he was particularly offended the FBI had the audacity to seek an interview with former Pakistan Prime Minister Bhutto, who might have had some relevant information. Now, I'd be concerned about a Speaker of the House interfering with a FBI investigation, whether it's of a Republican member or a Democrat member. Are you aware Are these threats to cut the FBI budget because of the FBI's investigation of fundraising activities by a member of the Speaker's party?
No, I'm not, Senator, and nor would they be well served with respect to the way I think I need to run the FBI. We don't respond to those type of pressures, whatever end of Pennsylvania Avenue they may be coming from. We do our job, we do it honestly, and we let the chips fall where they may.
Would it be safe to say whether you were an investigating member of either party, you're not going to be deterred by threats on your budget or anything else?
Absolutely not.
During the Terrorism Subcommittee's oversight hearings into the Ruby Ridge incident, I urged that the FBI lab be accredited as soon as possible. In fact, you instructed the lab to apply for accreditation back in 1995. The formal application is not going to be filed until the end of this year. And you have said that the FBI's major failure is not seeking accreditation sooner. Why is it taking the FBI so long to seek accreditation for the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, even after your 1995 order?
The accreditation process, as I learned, and I recently met with the laboratory directors, the ASCLD committee that certifies the laboratory, and they explained what a long-term and difficult and rigorous procedure that it is. We are taking steps to see if we can speed up the application prior to the fall of this year. One of the major problems with accreditation is the physical plant. An FBI laboratory should not, nor should any laboratory, be in a multi-story building. One of the problems with accreditation, particularly in the area of contamination and access, is where that laboratory has been constructed. The reason it's in that building is that somebody determined a long time ago that it should be on the tour route. It makes no sense to put a laboratory in a multi-story building, and that's been one of the problems with the accreditation. I hope to speed up the application process. As I said, I met personally with the scientists who do the accreditation. They're very optimistic, and we're very complimentary about our efforts to receive the accreditation, and we'll do it as quick as we can.
Well, I think it's extremely important because the FBI lab has suffered questions about its credibility and accountability, independence. This latest trial that brings somebody in from overseas. Back there, they brought in somebody from the National Crime Lab in Britain. Now, that crime lab is under the Home Secretary. It's not even under police. The Alabama and Virginia, they're separate divisions, I believe, and Senator Sessions would know this better than I, but I believe in Alabama it's under the Department of Forensic Sciences, and Virginia it's under the Division of Forensic Sciences. And I would hope that it would be moved outside, put under an independent factor. In fact, given the fact that the staff at the lab will end up all likely not being FBI agents, why not just have it outside the FBI entirely?
Well, even with the 100 civilian forensic examiners who we've hired, there still will be over 50, I think, FBI agents who will stay in that laboratory. My own view is that it's critical that it remain a part of the organization for a lot of practical as well as efficiency reasons. I think when this new laboratory is constructed in Quantico, we bring in an outside laboratory director. We've created new positions for civilian scientists to come in and oversee quality assurance. We have new instrumentation to purchase, which the Congress has authorized. We'll be accredited. I think we'll be a very strong and a very positive laboratory for the FBI. I also note that there was the testimony in Oklahoma also of a FBI laboratory special agent, Burmeister, who even one of our critics has described as brilliant, and I would not want to would want to acknowledge that too.
Well, I know how much state authorities, police and prosecutors rely on the FBI lab, and we've got to have a lab that cannot be attacked for the way that it is run, or you're going to have thousands and thousands of post-conviction relief probably are going to have some anyway throughout the country. In your testimony, you made some very strong statements about, and I quote, how uncrackable encryption will allow drug lords, terrorists, and even violent gangs to communicate with impunity. The strong, virtually unbreakable encryption is available today, is it not?
It certainly is, Senator, but there is no global interoperable network where encryption is not just used by the few, which is the case now, but where it would proliferate to the point where any kidnapper or any drug dealer could purchase it off the shelf and connect up with a network which would make all of those activities
But if they want to do it within their own network, they can. I mean, somebody can buy virtually unbreakable encryption today. If they've got a crime boss in New England, another one in a southeastern or southwestern state, they can today buy extremely powerful encryption abroad and a number of other places and use it.
They certainly can, but I guess my point is that encryption is here to stay. We're not going to eliminate it, but we can try to contain by policy-making decisions its proliferation. For instance, if you and I talk over an encrypted network, nobody can hear our conversations, but then to execute our agreement, I have to go out and use a payphone to call the other three co-conspirators. That's a part of the network which is not encrypted, which is accessible pursuant to a court order, and which we'd like to preserve.
But we have to, when we're looking at the national security interests of law enforcement or others, we have another major national security interest. We want to make sure our American companies compete in a global marketplace. Right now, the whole question is going to be, what is going to be the huge standard of encryption? Is it going to be European, Asian, or U.S. companies? Today, we have the potential of it being U.S. companies. But if we define it too narrowly, it's not going to be. 11 prominent computer security experts and cryptographers released a study a couple weeks ago called The Risks of Key Recovery, Key Escrow, and Trusted Third Party. They examined the administration's proposal for a key recovery system. They concluded it's too difficult, too costly, and too insecure, and raised serious questions about the ultimate viability of the key recovery systems. Do you have any reaction to that report?
Senator, it reminds me of the arguments that were made against the CLIA statute, that it was too costly, it was too difficult, and that it wasn't going to work. I think just as with the CLIA debate, the discussion with respect to encryption, and particularly in this body, has to be whether there are very important public safety and national security costs which have to be weighed against the costs, certainly the